consumer science, right? Used to be called home economics, now they call it consumer science, at least in the neighborhood schools. Yes, sir?
Does the same thing apply to computer science?
Computer science, oh, that's a good one. I didn't think of that one. Computer science is programming, right? It's a branch of math. There's nothing experimental in it, right? We would joke, experimental computer science is, like, you guys program it all? Experimental computer science is, oh, that didn't compile. Maybe I put a semicolon. No, maybe 2 semicolons, maybe no semicolon. Oh, parentheses, then a semicolon. Oh, compile, good. Right? That's experimental computer science, right? Yeah, computer science is a great one. It's not experimental, it's math, basically. It's applied mathematics, mathematics applied to a specific electronic system. The key is, people use science to mean truth. So if you say something is not science, it's like insulting. But it shouldn't be that way. Computer science is not science, really, but it's a great, very useful branch of study, and I approve of the study of computer science. Right? I think it's fascinating myself. Math is not science, but it's still cool, you know? And like history is not science, but it's still cool, right? And it does things that science can't. So, you know. All right, which leads me to the big question. Everyone wants to know this, right? Right, I just said I was an evangelical Christian. Don't you want to know this? Okay, so Dr. Dom, what do you think about evolution? Here's my answer. I'm a physicist, guys. I don't know anything about biology. There's like a Calvin cycle something, right? Okay, I don't know this stuff. That's my answer. If I tried to talk to you about it, I would make an idiot of myself because I don't know anything about biology. Okay, Dr. Dom, come on, you gotta say something about it. Okay, fine, I will say something about it, but I'm gonna pick something that I actually know about, okay? So here we go. Let's pick something I actually do study, physics, okay? Here's one. People who study these things are called cosmologists, okay? Cosmologists, like study the cosmos, see? Not cosmetologists, which is something else entirely, right? Okay, so cosmologists say, the universe began about 13 billion years ago. That's the number now. It was 15 when I was a kid, it moved to 11 when I was in college, now it's at 13. Whatever, these things happen, right? Okay, so, is that a scientific hypothesis? That's the question. Yeah, how would you test it exactly? Go ahead.
Time machines.
What? Time machines would be an excellent way to test it. You're correct. I don't exactly have an answer for that, except to say, you know, we don't have any. Oh. We could make a new universe too, and see how that one works. That might work too, but we can't do that. So, here's something I want you to think about. Consider this. I'm going to call this the historical method. You guys have been raised by good history teachers who teach you how to do history right. Okay? So you know that history is not just talking about repeating some stuff that was in a book and babbling about it, right? You know it's not just memorizing facts, right? You know that it's a synthesis of data. You know that you have to have data, right? I know your history teachers are big on that, right? And so you know you got to collect data, you got to do it rigorously. I know you have Dr. Victory, I know he was big on that. You have to analyze it, and that includes qualitative and quantitative analysis, right? So look at the numbers, also look at the overall stuff that you can't put into numbers. And you make hypotheses, and then you present that hypothesis, right? You support it with evidence, and then if there is new data, then you may have to revise your hypothesis. This happens all the time in history, right? Someone makes a new discovery, and you're like, oh, this changes the way we think about the early Roman Empire, because this, you know, this scroll shows blah, 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 right? Okay. Now I want you to compare that to the scientific method. Scientists collect data, they analyze it, and scientists do qualitative as well as quantitative analysis. Scientists make hypotheses, they present findings, and when new data comes out, they revise their findings. What's different? That's right. Science has an experiment in it. Historians cannot experiment, right? There's just nothing you can do. If you want to know, right, who really shot John F. Kennedy, there's no experiment you can perform that will tell you the answer to that, unless it involves one of Tim's time machines. Yes. So, this is the key part. If science is different from history, if those two are different, then the difference must be because of the experiment. Because everything else is the same between good history and good science. Make sense? Okay then. what does that mean about these questions? Certainly, any science results in technology has to be experimental. I wanted a picture here too. I just ran out of time. So, if you have a scientific disagreement, suppose I tell you, you guys remember the book drop thing with the big piece of paper in the book? My favorite experiment? Yeah, okay, Dave, I remember. Yeah, some of you don't remember. Well, I'll do it some other time. It's not much right now. It's still my favorite experiment, though, okay? But suppose I say, all objects fall at the same speed, at the same acceleration, in the absence of air resistance. And you say, no, they don't. And I say, yes, they do. And you say, no, they don't. And I show you Newton's second law, and you say, I don't care. They don't do that. I watch, look, and I drop two objects. Oh, so I say, well, there's air resistance. We argue on it. Okay, now, how could we resolve our dispute? Yeah, what would you do? What would we do, Gus?
You perform an experiment.
I know. Like?
Create a vacuum and two different mass objects like Tim Gus.
Yeah.
And
I'm also so skinny, I don't know.
you drop them through this vacuum without air.
Everybody dies.
Or any other vector. And hopefully you guys can get an agreement then with the results.
Right, exactly. So you can do exactly that, right? You take create a vacuum, you drop it, and the best way to do it is to determine in advance, right? You agree in advance. You'd be like, okay, we're going to make an agreement. If it comes out like so, then I'm right. If it comes out like so, then you're right. Okay? That's the best way to do it. You do it all beforehand so that you don't have a bias. You don't try and bias the data. You just decide in advance it's going to happen, right? And then you do it. And in principle, even if that was enough, you could do it again and again, right? Until Gus and Tim suffocate. And even then, they'll probably still have about the same mass, so you can still keep doing it.
Oh boy.
And so, right? So you can do it. You can resolve it with experiments. Now, the universe began 13 billion years ago, and someone else says, no, it began 6,000 years ago. Right? Now, I can say, well, here's evidence from the amount of time light would reach us. And you'd say, no, the light was created mid-flight. Okay? And I say, okay, fine. Well, I talk about planetary formation. He's like, no, that's just a theory you made up. Have you ever seen a planet form? The answer is no, so okay. Right? And everything you come up, he can come up with a counter-argument. And you might not think it's a good one, but it's an argument. Right? And you might say, oh, that one's ridiculous, but it's still an argument, and you don't have an experiment to disprove it with. So instead of experimenting about this, the only way to resolve it is by arguing. And let's be honest, that doesn't resolve anything, right? It just gets people very riled up. So, this is the problem. Questions about the past, by and large, cannot be resolved experimentally. Because it already happened. So you can't do this controlled experiment now. It already happened. And this means, people get mad at me when I say this. This means that that's not science. That people get mad because when I say that, they usually reverse phrases like that, like as an insult, right? But I'm not using it as an insult. I think, all studies of the past are fantastic things to do, but they don't use a scientific method. They're missing the key piece. There's no experiment. And if there's no experiment, there's no difference from history. Not a single difference. They collect data, and they analyze it, and they make hypotheses, and they argue about it, supporting their arguments with evidence, just like a history paper. Because you're talking about the past, of course it is, right? So, what do I think about evolution? I don't know, I wasn't there. But I would say this. Wouldn't it be awesome if I were there? Okay, what I would say this is, to study things like the origin of the universe is not an experimental science. That doesn't mean it's not worth studying. It's very interesting to study, in fact. But it's not an experimental science. It's closer to history than it is to science. Right? The method it uses is a historical method. And what does that mean? It means that, what do you accept? Rather than appealing to an experiment, right, you have to appeal to an argument based on evidence. Rather than Tim and Gus, we agree beforehand, if Tim and Gus hit the ground at the same time, then I'm right, and if they hit ground at different times, then you're right, and then we do it, right? Rather than that, we just say, no, I'm right because of this. 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 You may think each other's arguments are stupid, but that you haven't convinced each other anything, right? And this is why the evolution debate doesn't resolve. Because you can't resolve it experimentally. And so people can disagree with one side, will give arguments, and the other side thinks they're bad arguments, but they're still arguments. They still could be true. The universe could have been created this morning. How would you know? Really, how would you know? Your memories could have been created with it. See? Right? Well, that's just part of your neurons, right? So your neurons could have been created just like that. How do you know?
Well, I learned my dream last night, so.
Or maybe your neurons were just there when they were created with the memory of your dream from last night. Now, I don't actually believe that's true. I'm just saying that's not a disprovable statement. Okay, but to say that a heavy object falls faster than a light one, that's a disprovable statement, right? That one, just do an experiment and find out. But to talk about what happened in the past, no longer so provable, something you can argue about. And so, I don't have an answer on evolution. I'm not a biologist, frankly. I don't think it's very interesting. I don't care that much. Okay, that's really the answer. But but about things that I do know more about, like the physics stuff, the answer is we have some interesting theories, and they've got their points. But we don't know. It's not experimental. I've got more faith in the Higgs boson than I do that the universe began 13 billion years ago. Especially because when I was a kid, it was 15. So like when my kid's born, it might be like 17, you know? So, all right. So that's that. Final one. Kind of cool, right? Science does not solve all problems. You might say, and I think you can see one possible counterexample I might offer, right? Doc Knock pointed out this one. I thought it was good. The water wheel is the earliest generator, okay? It takes natural energy and transforms it into usable work energy, right? By taking gravitational potential energy and converting it into kinetic energy. Right. Okay, good. He says, do we call that more primitive than a nuclear power plant? Well, a nuclear power plant, of course, is much harder to build, right? Far more expensive. You have to mine and enrich uranium to use it. It creates a lot more power, but what else does it create? Radioactive waste, right? A water wheel has a carbon footprint of 0, right? It is an entirely renewable resource, and it will never melt down and explode, right? So, that's true.
Do you have an experiment to back that one up?
That would be an awesome experiment. SIR, anyone? Okay. And even if a 9.0 earthquake triggers and a tsunami strikes the water wheel, it's going to be gone, but there won't be any radiation left in the environment. You won't have to be taking iodine pills. Right? So, which one's more advanced? Did science actually solve problems? Let's think about a few other ones. Well, there's the LOM. Amazing work of engineering and science. Utterly incredible. Virtually every great physicist of the 20th century worked on the atomic bomb, from Einstein to Feynman. Feynman was a grad student, and Einstein was sort of the grandfather of it. They all worked on it. Amazing achievement from an engineering standpoint. What did they achieve? Well, the ability to wipe out large quantities of people and buildings and all their hopes and dreams all at once. And to render the ground radioactive, and to spray the radiation into the atmosphere so that it can carry around the Earth and irradiate other places, increasing the risk of cancer and causing radiation poisoning. So what do we achieve exactly? Now you might be like, okay, Dr. Dong, it's true that science has done resulted in some of that stuff, but it's also resulted in a lot of good stuff. How about medical science? You're right. I mean, I use medical science all the time, right? I have acid reflux. I take antacids. It's great. Love it. But let's look at something if that actually solved things. Here's some statistics for you. Since 1960, life expectancy has gone up 11.4%. That's very good. Right? It's went from 70 to 78. It's very impressive, given that we were starting with a pretty high bar already. Okay, so now our life expectancy is up to 78. In Swaziland, the life expectancy is 28, so that's pretty impressive. Wow. Yeah, scary, huh? In that same time period, if you look at the statistics, the suicide rate in the United States has increased by 60%. Meaning that all the advances of medical science, which resulted in that greater life expectancy, have been counteracted, more than counteracted, by an increase in suicide rate. And if you want to follow up with the non-fatal ones, the anxiety diagnosis in the US is 18.1%. That is a big jump from the 50s. stupid article isn't available online. I only had the abstract. The abstract said it was 1 standard deviation, didn't tell me the actual number, which is very upsetting. And according to various sources, something like 10 to 15% of Americans have clinical depression. 10 to 15%? Notice how big that number is? If you add those two together, you're getting a pretty big number here. To be fair, there's lots of overlap. Anxiety and depression don't go together. Right? So, you know, the rate of medication has increased substantially since we've discovered various drugs to treat them. And as the rate of medication has increased to treat anxiety and depression-related disorders, as that rate of medication has increased, the rate of diagnosis you would expect it to, like with smallpox, as vaccination increased, the incidence of smallpox decreased, right? As we medicated things like anxiety and depression more, the rate of diagnosis has skyrocketed, right? More than just increased. It's gone way up. There's diagnosis issues, and there's social issues as well. It's not all medical issues. But the point is, what did we actually solve? Right? Look, we can cure all sorts of things we couldn't cure 100 years ago. But what did we fix? If people are now if there are now just more people taking their own lives. So, the question is, really, what's missing from science? I think I made the case that science is not a complete system. It's not a belief system. It's not a religion, right? It's a part of gaining information about this, but it doesn't include everything. There's other things in our life, right? Science doesn't fix them. And they try, and I appreciate very much all the people who work on it. And yet, still, there's something missing, right? It doesn't all do it. You know, when it comes down to it, science is a matter of, not science, why we believe science is a matter of our experience. We believe things we experience. This is what I mean. Suppose you did a physics problem, and you got that the answer is, if you dropped a rock, it would go upwards at 20 meters per second. What might you say?
No.
What? Yeah, what do you say?
That's not right.
That's not right. I guess I screwed up somewhere. Let me look for the minus sign that I missed, right? And it's always a minus sign, we know that. Right? I get that all the time on my physics problems. Someone has something going the wrong direction. You hit a patch of friction, you hit the brakes and end up going faster than when you started, right? You're like, wait, that's not right. Why did you say that's not right? Why didn't you just believe your results? Because it contradicted your experience, right? There is something in your mind that is higher than science. It is your experience, right? Your science can tell you that the sky is green. And you're like, no, it's not. And who wins? You or science? You, right? Okay, now obviously that's not science, right? So the point is, everything is built into our experience. The reason we accept science for so much is because of this, right? It's because we experience the cell phone. They tell us this is a piece of science in my hand, and say, oh, then I like science, right? But it comes down to our experience. And this is where things besides science come in. I call this science of Christianity. I should mention something about Christianity. Here's the fact. You can say whatever you want, right? You can do whatever you want. You can figure out many things. So the fact is people have problems, right? We have lots of problems. One of the big problems is, what do we do? Ethics, right? What should we do in situations? What is the right thing to do? And the problem with it is that if you do the wrong thing, then there's another sensation that comes with it. We call it guilt, right? Guilt means, I wish I didn't do that. What's the solution to guilt? Well, certainly not a scientific one, not to my knowledge. I don't know if they have medication for it. They might. You can rationalize it. In other words, you can say, no, what I did was totally fine, right? But the fact is, you rationalize it, inside, it still nags at you, right? You can say, no, I was right, and they were wrong, but it still bothers you. It doesn't make it go away, right? And you can just sort of give into it, I was wrong, I'm sorry, but it's still there, right? It doesn't go away, and science says nothing about it. And that's something we can experience, right? To be a Christian is to experience forgiveness and to experience it. To know the Lord by experience and not because someone said so. You know, I love science. I happen to think I'm a pretty good scientist myself. But there are a lot of things that discovering that, measuring single top fork production doesn't help you with somehow, right? Let me tell you a story. Here's one that's hard to get in trouble with. How about where do you go to college? Where do you go to college? Right? How do you decide that? Well, this is a story. You guys are not going to believe this story. It's totally true, okay? You're not going to believe it. All right. I applied to 3 schools. 3, not 30, right? 3, because you only get to go to 1, by the way. Okay, so I applied to 3 schools. I applied to UCLA, because that's where everyone in my family went. I grew up in California. I applied to, where else did I apply? Caltech. Heard of that. I applied to, okay, I was only going to apply to those 2, but I was really pushy college counselor. She's kind of like Ms. Yulia, but Chinese. That's the only difference. Okay, in all of them, so she had a Chinese accent instead of a Russian accent. Everything else was the same. Okay, there was Miss Wing, and she was very, very pushy. She was great. Our school was a low-income area of East LA, but we had like 90% of the class go to college because she would just call them into her office one at a time and be like, here, which of these colleges do you want to go to? And they're like, but she's like, I think you should go to this one. Here's a scholarship form for you to fill this. Bring this back to me next week. And they would just do it. She was great. Okay, so she's pushy. You just don't really say no to her. Kind of like Miss Yulia, right? So she comes and she's like, Peter, she didn't call me Dr. Bob. She's like, Peter, you are not going to only apply to 2 schools. And I'm like, she's like, you have to apply to an Ivy League school. And I said, okay, Miss Wing. Because you just don't argue with Miss Wing. So I'm like, okay, Miss Wing, where should I apply? She's like, where do you want to go? I'm like, I don't know. Totally didn't follow this stuff at all. Okay? She's like, how about Harvard? Okay, I'll apply to Harvard. Great. So I did. I went home, I dug through my junk mail, right? Did those big stacks of college brochures. Ah, here's the Harvard one. Right? Back then the applications were on paper. You had to type them, a typewriter. Horrible. Oh, yeah, I know. Can you imagine suffering? Okay, so I filled that out, right? I sent it in. Well, I got into all 3. That's great, but you only get to go to 1 of them, right? Not only did I get into all 3, but and at first I was kind of still planning to go to UCLA all along. Do you know how much cheaper it is? Also, they gave me a scholarship, a big scholarship. You think it's like a full ride scholarship, but it was actually more than that. It was actually more than full. It's actually so much scholarship money that after paying tuition and room and board and books, I would still have some left over, so I'd actually have to pay tax on it. That's how much money I got. Yeah. Well, it was cheaper back then too. Right? So that was very attractive. Plus, it's a great campus. It's in California. It doesn't snow there. So anyway, I really wanted to go to UCLA. You guys don't believe me. You're like, oh, of course you got into Harvard. But I was like, no, I want to go to UCLA. So what I do, okay, well, here's where the other part comes in. Okay, so I was a Christian, right? So I said, okay, what are you supposed to do about it? Well, you pray about it, right? So I prayed about it. Nothing happened. No thunderbolts or anything, right? I'm like, okay. Well, anyway, while I'm doing that, I'll go visit some schools. So I visited some schools. I didn't visit some schools, I'm lying. I visited 1 school. I went to UCLA. I was totally not going to fly out to Boston. Absolutely not. I was editor-in-chief of the newspaper, and we had a hardcore newspaper, and there was a deadline that weekend. No, not even a question. So I went to UCLA. I didn't even go to Caltech, it's right there, but anyway, I went to UCLA. I had friends there, I stayed the night with them, I went and saw the campus, I was like, this is a great place. And then I went home, and I drove home, and I was like, that was a great school, and I know people there, and it's really nice, and it's friendly, and it's all the good stuff. And it's so cheap, right? It's so much money we're talking about here. And so I said, I haven't received any answers to my prayers particularly. I think I'm just going to go to UCLA. All right? And then God said no. And you're like, what do you mean he said no? Did you hear him? I don't know, okay? I don't know. All I know is that I had the strongest, most clear sensation I'd ever had that no, go to Harvard. And I was like, oh, it was so strong that at the time I was like, oh, I guess I'm going to Harvard then. There was no one around me, nothing was happening. I just knew that, oh, I'm going to Harvard then. I told my parents that. They were like, well, let's see how about the money. We wrote them letters asking for more money. They didn't respond about the money until May 30th. April 30th was when I got back a response about the money, okay? You know, May 1st is the deadline to decide, right? And so we were waiting on the money thing. And you know what, the whole time, I wasn't worried. I knew I was going to go. And so they sent the amount, and they offered us, they gave us another $5,000 basically. And my parents said, okay, we can afford this, you can go. And so I
Pay attention, please. Earl Mangulanan, report to the 1505 RC office, and Ryan Chua, report to the 1505 RC office.
Always 1505. So then I went to Harvard. Great place. Now, of course, I would say, well, I thought it was a great experience. It would have been very different. But of course, I would say that no matter where I come, right? You know, you can't say that. But I do know that I was told by the Lord to go there. You might well say,